10-year-old Mary Catherine Labro pressed her small hands against the cool glass of her bedroom window, watching the morning mist rise from the mighty Mississippi River below. The date was May 18th, 1863, and something terrible was coming to Vicksburg. She could feel it in the way her mother's voice trembled when she thought no one was listening, in the hurried whispers between her father and the other men, who gathered in their parlor each evening, their faces gray beneath the flickering candlelight. The city had always been her entire world, perched high on the bluffs overlooking the great river, with its elegant mansions and bustling streets filled with merchants, steamboat captains, and cotton traders. But now, everything felt different, strange. The usual morning sounds of commerce and conversation had been replaced by something more urgent. The distant rumble of artillery, the hurried clip-clop of horses carrying messengers through the streets, and most unsettling of all, the steady stream of families arriving with wagons piled high with their possessions. Mary Catherine had overheard her parents discussing these newcomers, refugees, they called them, families who had fled from the surrounding countryside, as General Ulysses Simpson Grant's Union forces swept through Mississippi like a merciless tide. The Hendersons from the Delta Plantation, the Walkers from Champion Hill, the entire Morrison clan from their farm near Jackson all had arrived in the past weeks, their faces etched with exhaustion and fear, seeking sanctuary within Vicksburg's supposedly impregnable defenses. Her mother, Elizabeth Labro, had thrown herself into organizing relief efforts for these displaced families. Their once pristine home now served as a temporary shelter, with mattresses spread across the floors of spare rooms and the basement converted into a makeshift kitchen. Mary Catherine watched as women she had never seen before prepared meals with whatever provisions they had managed to salvage from their abandoned homes. Among the refugees was 8-year-old Thomas Jefferson Miller, whose family had fled their farm when Union soldiers appeared on their horizon 3 days prior. Thomas clutched a wooden toy soldier his grandfather had carved for him, the only possession he had been able to grab as his family loaded their wagon in desperate haste. His mother, Sarah Miller, spent her days staring toward the north, wondering if their farmhouse still stood or if it had been reduced to ashes like so many others. They had passed on their journey to Vicksburg. The children sensed the adults' fear even when they tried to hide it behind forced smiles and reassuring words. 13-year-old Rebecca Walsh, whose father served as a clerk in the Confederate quartermaster's office, had noticed how the grown-ups stopped talking whenever she entered a room. She had learned to linger in doorways and press her ear to walls, gathering fragments of information that painted an increasingly dire picture of their situation. According to historical accounts documented in the Civil War, a narrative by Shelby Foote, the siege preparations had been underway for weeks as Confederate General John Clifford Pemberton recognized the strategic importance of holding Vicksburg at all costs. The city's position commanded the Mississippi River, and President Abraham Lincoln himself had declared that the war could never be won until the Union controlled this vital waterway. But for the children and families trapped within the city's defensive perimeter, these grand strategic considerations meant little compared to the growing fear that gnawed at their bellies alongside the increasing hunger as supply lines were severed one by one. The morning of May 22nd, 1863, shattered any remaining illusions of safety when the first Union artillery shell screamed over the city's defensive works and exploded in the heart of Vicksburg's residential district. Mary Catherine Labro was helping her mother distribute breakfast to the refugee families sheltering in their home when the initial bombardment began. The sound unlike anything the young girl had ever experienced, a howling, shrieking noise that seemed to tear the very air apart before culminating in thunderous explosions that rattled every window in the house. Elizabeth Labro immediately began herding the children toward the basement, her voice steady despite the terror in her eyes. "This is just like the storm cellars back home," she told them, though everyone knew the storm was man-made and far more deadly than any tornado. As shells continued to fall throughout the day, families throughout Vicksburg faced the same desperate choice: seek shelter in basements, root cellars, or the natural caves that dotted the hillsides around the city. The Walsh family, along with their neighbors, decided to dig their own cave into the yellow clay hillside behind their house. Rebecca Walsh watched as her father and the other men worked frantically with shovels and pickaxes, carving out what would become their underground home for the duration of the siege. The children helped by carrying away buckets of dirt and clay, their small hands blistered within hours, but their determination unwavering. By the third day of constant shelling, patterns had emerged in the daily rhythm of survival. The Union artillery typically began their bombardment at dawn, continued sporadically throughout the day, and intensified again in the evening hours. Families learned to time their movements accordingly, venturing out for supplies and necessities during the brief lulls, then scrambling back to their underground refuges. When the telltale whistle of incoming shells resumed, young Thomas Jefferson Miller had stopped speaking altogether after witnessing a shell explode just 2 houses down from where his family had taken shelter. His mother, Sarah Miller, spent hours each day trying to coax words from her traumatized son, but the boy seemed to have retreated into himself, clutching his wooden soldier and staring at nothing with eyes that had seen too much for someone so young. The refugee situations had grown increasingly desperate as more families fled to Vicksburg only to find themselves trapped in what was rapidly becoming a death trap. The city's population had swelled from approximately 4,000 to nearly 12,000 residents, straining already limited resources beyond their breaking point. Food supplies, which had been adequate for the normal population, now had to feed 3 times as many mouths while supply lines remained severed by the encircling Union forces. Dr. William Balfour, the city's chief medical officer, had converted several churches and public buildings into makeshift hospitals, but even these proved inadequate as civilian casualties mounted. Children were particularly vulnerable, not just to the direct effects of the bombardment, but to the diseases that flourished in the overcrowded, unsanitary conditions of the underground shelters. Mary Catherine had begun keeping a diary, writing by candlelight in the basement that now served as home for her family and 6 others. Her entries, though written in a child's hand, captured the daily horror with startling clarity. "The shells sound like wild animals screaming," she wrote on May 25th. "Mrs. Henderson's baby cries all the time now, and I think it's because she doesn't have enough milk. Mother says we must share everything, but there's not much left to share." The psychological toll on the children manifested in various ways. Some, like Thomas Miller, withdrew completely. Others became hypervigilant, jumping at every sound. Rebecca Walsh had appointed herself the unofficial lookout for her cave community, spending hours peering through the small opening they had left for air and light, watching for signs of incoming shells so she could warn the others to take cover. By early June 1863, the cave communities beneath Vicksburg had developed their own social structures and survival systems. The Labro family's basement shelter now housed 14 people, including 3 infants whose cries echoed off the damp walls day and night. Mary Catherine had become adept at distinguishing between different types of artillery shells. By their sound, the sharp crack of rifled guns, the deeper boom of mortars, and the terrifying shriek of the mass of Parrott guns that could penetrate even their underground sanctuaries. The children had created games to help cope with their confined existence and constant fear. Rebecca Walsh had invented shell bingo, where points were awarded for correctly identifying the type and distance of explosions. Thomas Jefferson Miller, though still largely mute, had begun carving miniature figures from scraps of wood, creating an entire army of tiny soldiers that he arranged and rearranged obsessively on the cave floor. Food had become the dominant concern for every family. The Confederate commissary, overwhelmed by the swollen population, had reduced rations to subsistence levels. Cornmeal, when available, was often mixed with ground peas or even sawdust to stretch the supply. Fresh meat had become virtually non-existent, leading some families to capture and cook rats, cats, and even mules. Mary Catherine wrote in her diary, "Mother made soup from something today, but wouldn't tell me what was in it. It tasted strange, but I was too hungry to care." The women had organized themselves into efficient units for survival. Elizabeth Laubrow had emerged as a natural leader, coordinating food distribution, medical care, and child supervision among the refugee families. She had convinced several women with medical knowledge to establish a rotation system for caring for the sick and injured, while others took responsibility for maintaining sanitation in the cramped quarters. Water procurement had become a daily challenge requiring careful timing and tremendous courage. The city's wells were often targeted by Union sharpshooters, who had positioned themselves across the river and on the surrounding hills. Groups of women and older children would venture out during the quieter periods, usually just before dawn, to gather water and any available supplies from abandoned houses and stores. 11-year-old Patricia Balfour, daughter of the city's medical officer, had become an expert at scavenging. She knew which houses had been completely abandoned and which might still contain useful items, hidden in root cellars or buried in gardens. Her small size allowed her to squeeze through openings too narrow for adults, and her keen eye for valuable items made her an invaluable member of the foraging expeditions. The children's education continued in the caves, though in radically altered form. Several of the refugee women were former teachers who organized informal lessons in reading, writing, and arithmetic. Rebecca Walsh had become fascinated with military strategy and tactics, studying the positioning of Union forces by carefully observing their artillery patterns and trying to predict where the next attacks would occur. Medical care presented enormous challenges in the underground environment. Dr. Balfour made daily rounds through the cave communities, treating everything from minor cuts and burns to serious injuries from falling debris and shell fragments. The lack of proper medical supplies meant that many conditions that would have been easily treatable under normal circumstances became life-threatening emergencies. The psychological support that the children provided for each other had become crucial for maintaining morale among the adult population. Mary Catherine had begun organizing evening storytelling sessions where children would share tales from before the siege, creating brief escapes from their harsh reality. These sessions often moved the adults to tears, reminding them of the normal world that still existed beyond the rain of Union artillery. Religious faith sustained many families. Through the darkest moments, makeshift prayer services were held in the larger caves, with hymns sung in whispered voices to avoid attracting attention from Union observers. The children learned to find comfort in familiar prayers and psalms, even when the words sometimes seemed insufficient to address the magnitude of their suffering. July 4th, 1863, dawned with an eerie silence that had become almost more frightening than the constant bombardment. Mary Catherine Labro pressed her eye to the small opening of their cave shelter, watching the empty streets of Vicksburg bake in the Mississippi summer heat. The absence of exploding shells felt unnatural after 6 weeks of continuous siege warfare, and the children whispered among themselves, wondering if this strange quiet meant their ordeal was finally ending. The hunger had become a living thing. By this point, gnawing constantly at everyone's consciousness, Confederate General John Clifford Pemberton's food stores had dwindled to virtually nothing, and civilian rations had been reduced to a handful of cornmeal per person per day. Many families had not seen fresh meat, vegetables, or dairy products in weeks. The children bore the hunger differently. Some became listless and withdrawn, while others grew irritable and prone to tears over the smallest frustrations. Thomas Jefferson Miller had finally begun speaking again, but only to ask repeatedly when they could go home. His mother, Sarah Miller, had grown gaunt and hollow-eyed, spending her meager food rations to keep her son fed, while she herself survived on whatever scraps remained. The wooden toy soldier he had carried from their abandoned farm had become worn smooth from constant handling, its painted features long since rubbed away by small fingers seeking comfort. The cave communities had developed elaborate systems for sharing resources and supporting the most vulnerable members. Elizabeth Laubrow had organized the women into cooking brigades that could make the most of whatever ingredients were available. They had learned to create surprisingly nourishing meals from the most unlikely combinations: boiled leather seasoned with whatever herbs could be found, growing wild in abandoned gardens, soup made from bones that had been boiled and reboiled until they crumbled into calcium-rich powder. Water had become almost as precious as food. The Mississippi River was controlled by Union gunboats, and most of the city's wells were under constant sniper fire. Children like Rebecca Walsh had become expert at timing their water-gathering expeditions to coincide with shift changes among the Union observers. Learning to move with the silent efficiency of seasoned soldiers despite their young age, the adults tried to maintain some semblance of normal routine for the children's sake. But the facade was wearing thin. Patricia and Balfour had overheard her father discussing casualty reports with other medical personnel, not just military casualties, but civilian deaths from disease, malnutrition, and the direct effects of the bombardment. She understood, with the terrible clarity that comes to children in extreme situations, that some of the families they had shared their shelter with were never going home. Educational activities had taken on a different character as the siege progressed. The children were learning practical skills that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances: how to identify edible plants, how to prepare food from unusual sources, how to treat minor wounds and illness with improvised remedies. Rebecca Walsh had become particularly skilled at recognizing the sound patterns that indicated incoming artillery, allowing the cave community's precious seconds to take additional cover. The psychological toll on the children manifested in their Play and conversation, Mary Catherine's diary entries had grown shorter and more matter-of-fact, recording the daily realities of their existence with the detached precision of a military report. Her childhood games had been replaced by activities focused on survival, sorting through debris for useful materials, helping to reinforce their shelter against potential cave-ins, assisting with the constant task of food preparation and distribution. Medical care had become increasingly desperate as Dr. Balfour's supplies ran out. The children suffered from various ailments related to their living conditions: respiratory problems from the damp, poorly ventilated caves, skin conditions from lack of proper sanitation, and digestive issues from their radically altered diet. Many showed signs of malnutrition, despite the adults' efforts to ensure the children received priority for whatever food was available. The bonds formed between families during the siege created a new kind of extended kinship network. Children who had been strangers 6 weeks earlier now looked after each other with the fierce protectiveness of siblings. When young Thomas Miller developed a fever, all the women in their shelter took turns caring for him as if he were their own son, while the other children shared their meager possessions to help comfort him during his illness. July 12, 1863, brought news that spread through the cave communities like wildfire. General Pemberton had entered into negotiations with General Grant regarding the surrender of Vicksburg. For the children, who had spent nearly 2 months underground, the concept of surrender was both terrifying and incomprehensible. Mary Catherine Loughborough sat in the dim candlelight of their shelter, listening to the adults debate in hushed, urgent tones while trying to understand what this development might mean for their survival. The formal discussions between the military commanders seemed abstract and remote compared to the immediate reality of their daily struggle. Rebecca Walsh had become skilled at reading the moods and expressions of the adults around her, and she could see that even the possibility of surrender brought no relief to their faces. Instead, she detected a new kind of fear and uncertainty about what would happen to Confederate civilians under Union occupation, worry about retribution, and the overwhelming question of how they would rebuild their lives from the ruins of everything they had known. Thomas Jefferson Miller had begun asking different questions as news of the surrender negotiations filtered down to the children. Instead of asking when they could go home, he now asked if their farm would still be there, if their animals had survived, if the Union soldiers would let them return. His mother, Sarah Miller, found herself unable to answer these questions honestly, knowing that their property had likely been looted, burned, or occupied by Union forces months earlier. The physical condition of the cave communities had deteriorated dramatically over the past weeks. The summer heat, combined with poor ventilation and overcrowding, had created a breeding ground for disease. Several children had developed severe dysentery, and the adults struggled to maintain basic sanitation with their limited resources. The smell of unwashed bodies, inadequate waste disposal, and general decay had become a constant presence that everyone had learned to ignore. Patricia and Balfour had witnessed her father's growing desperation as his medical supplies dwindled to nothing. She watched him attempt to treat serious injuries and illnesses with improvised remedies, seeing the frustration and heartbreak in his eyes when children suffered from conditions that would have been easily treatable under normal circumstances. Her own childish faith in adults' ability to fix problems had been shattered by the realization that even the most knowledgeable and caring grown-ups were helpless against the overwhelming challenges they faced. The food situation had reached catastrophic levels. Families were surviving on portions that would have been considered starvation rations. Even at the beginning of the siege, Mary Catherine had stopped growing entirely during their underground ordeal, her clothes hanging loose on her diminished frame. The adults tried to hide their own physical deterioration from the children, but it was impossible to conceal the hollow cheeks, the trembling hands, and the general weakness that affected everyone in their community. Educational activities had been largely abandoned in favor of pure survival tasks. The children spent their days helping with whatever work needed to be done, reinforcing cave walls, processing what little food was available, caring for the sick and injured, and maintaining the complex social systems that had developed in their underground world. Rebecca Walsh had become particularly valuable as a messenger, her small size and familiarity with the cave network allowing her to carry information and supplies between different shelter communities. The psychological state of the children reflected the extreme stress of their situation. Many had developed symptoms that would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress, sleep disturbances, hypervigilance, emotional numbness, and difficulty trusting in any kind of future beyond their immediate survival. Mary Catherine's diary entries had become increasingly fragmented and disconnected, reflecting the mental strain of their prolonged ordeal. Religious observance had intensified as the situation became more desperate. The cave communities held prayer services multiple times each day, with the children participating in ways that would have been considered inappropriate under normal social circumstances. Young voices joined in hymns and prayers with an intensity born of genuine fear and the basic human need to find meaning and hope in the midst of suffering. That seemed to have no end. The relationships between children and adults had fundamentally changed during the siege. Traditional authority structures had broken down as survival became the only priority. Children like Patricia and Balfour had taken on responsibilities normally reserved for adults, while many grown-ups had become dependent on the children's energy, resilience, and unique abilities to cope with their transformed circumstances. July 4th, 1863 Independence Day became the day that Vicksburg surrendered, though this bitter irony was lost on none of the adults, who had spent 4 to 7 days defending the city. Mary Catherine Labro emerged from her family's cave shelter into blinding sunlight that hurt her eyes after weeks of candlelit dimness, squinting at the strange sight of Union soldiers walking through the streets of her hometown. The blue uniforms seemed impossibly bright and clean compared to the ragged gray of the Confederate defenders, and the children stared in fascination at these men who had been anonymous voices behind the artillery shells that had terrorized them for so long. The formal surrender ceremony had taken place between the military commanders, but for the civilian population, the transition felt both abrupt and anticlimactic. Rebecca Walsh watched from her family's cave entrance as Union soldiers began the process of occupying the city, noting with the observational skills she had developed during the siege that many of these men looked almost as tired and worn as the Confederate defenders they were replacing. Thomas Jefferson Miller spoke his first complete sentence in weeks when he saw the Union soldiers. "Are they going to hurt us?" His mother, Sarah Miller, realized she had no idea how to answer this question. The propaganda they had heard throughout the war painted Union forces as barbaric invaders, but the reality of occupation proved far more complex and nuanced than the simple narratives that had sustained them during the darkest days of the siege. The immediate priority for Union commanders was preventing a humanitarian catastrophe among the civilian population. Medical personnel accompanying Grant's army were shocked by the condition of the cave-dwelling families, particularly the children, who showed obvious signs of severe malnutrition and disease. Dr. William Balfour found himself working alongside Union doctors to treat the most serious cases, a collaboration that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. Food distribution became the first major challenge of the occupation. Union supply lines, which had successfully starved the city into submission, now had to feed the same population they had been trying to defeat. Mary Catherine watched in amazement as Union soldiers distributed hardtack, salt pork, and other rations that seemed like luxury items compared to the meager portions they had survived on. During the final weeks of the siege, the process of returning to normal living conditions proved more difficult than anyone had anticipated. Many families had grown so accustomed to their underground existence that the prospect of returning to damaged or destroyed homes felt overwhelming. Patricia and Balfour discovered that her family's house had been struck by several shells, leaving it barely habitable, while the Walsh family found their home completely destroyed, with only the foundation stones remaining to mark where it had once stood. The refugee families faced even greater challenges. The Millers and dozens of other families who had fled to Vicksburg from the surrounding countryside now found themselves displaced persons in their own region, uncertain whether their original homes still existed or whether they would be welcome to return to areas now under Union control. Thomas Jefferson Miller's wooden toy soldier, worn smooth by months of handling, had become his most precious possession, a tangible link to the life his family had lost. Union occupation forces attempted to restore basic civil services, but the infrastructure of the city had been severely damaged by weeks of bombardment. Schools had been destroyed or converted to other uses, churches bore the scars of artillery hits, and the commercial district lay in ruins. The children, who had spent their formative weeks in caves, now faced the challenge of readjusting to a world that bore little resemblance to the one they remembered from before the siege. Medical care for the civilian population became a priority for the Union administration. The children, in particular, required extensive treatment for conditions ranging from malnutrition and parasitic infections to psychological trauma that manifested in various behavioral problems. Rebecca Walsh had difficulty sleeping in a regular bed after weeks of sleeping on cave floors, while Mary Catherine found herself unable to concentrate on normal childhood activities. After months of focusing exclusively on survival, the complex emotions surrounding the end of the siege created confusion and conflict within families and communities. Relief at the end of the bombardment mixed with shame over defeat. Gratitude for Union medical care conflicted with resentment over the destruction of their city, and hope for the future competed with grief for everything that had been lost. The children absorbed these conflicting emotions from the adults around them, adding another layer of complexity to their already traumatic experience. Educational efforts began almost immediately, with Union authorities recognizing that the children's interrupted schooling represented a significant challenge for the city's recovery. However, many children, including Mary Catherine Loughborough, found it difficult to focus on traditional academic subjects after their intensive education in survival skills and military strategy during the siege. August 15, 1863, marked 6 weeks since the surrender of Vicksburg. But for the children who had lived through the siege, the transition to peacetime proved to be its own form of challenge. Mary Catherine Loughborough sat in what remained of her family's parlor, attempting to read a book that her mother had salvaged from their damaged library. But the words seemed to blur together as her mind wandered back to the relative safety and certainty of their cave shelter. The irony was not lost on her. She found herself missing the very place that had represented terror and deprivation just weeks earlier. The physical reconstruction of Vicksburg proceeded slowly, hampered by the massive destruction throughout the city and the limited resources available for civilian needs. Union military priorities focused on maintaining the strategic position along the Mississippi River, while civilian concerns often took secondary importance. Rebecca Walsh had become fascinated by the engineering challenges involved in rebuilding, spending hours watching Union construction crews repair bridges, clear debris, and restore basic infrastructure to the war-torn city for refugee families like the Millers. The end of the siege marked the beginning of a new kind of uncertainty. Thomas Jefferson Miller had finally been reunited with his father, who had spent the war months hiding in the Mississippi swamps to avoid conscription. But their family farm had been completely destroyed during the Union advance through the countryside. The wooden toy soldier that had sustained Thomas through the siege now seemed like a relic from another lifetime, as his family faced the daunting prospect of starting over with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The psychological effects of the siege experience proved more lasting and complex than anyone had anticipated. Many children displayed symptoms that would not be formally recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder for decades to come, but the behavioral changes were evident to anyone who observed them closely. Patricia and Balfour had developed an obsessive need to stockpile food, hiding scraps and leftovers throughout their reconstructed home despite her parents' assurances that supply shortages were no longer a concern. Educational efforts faced significant challenges as teachers attempted to resume normal classroom instruction with children who had experienced profound trauma and disruption. Mary Catherine found herself far ahead of her peers in certain practical skills. She could identify different types of artillery by sound, prepare nutritious meals from minimal ingredients, and organize efficient distribution systems for scarce resources, but she struggled with basic arithmetic and reading comprehension that had come easily before the siege. The social dynamics of post-siege Vicksburg reflected the complex realities of military occupation and civilian adjustment. Union soldiers, many of whom had been genuinely shocked by the condition of the cave-dwelling families, often went out of their way to help individual children and families, creating relationships that complicated the simple narratives of occupation and resistance. Rebecca Walsh had struck up an unlikely friendship with a young Union corporal from Ohio, who helped her family rebuild their destroyed home. While her parents struggled with conflicting feelings of gratitude and resentment, medical recovery proved to be a long-term process for many of the siege survivors. Dr. William Balfour, working now alongside Union medical personnel, documented the lasting health effects of prolonged malnutrition and stress on the children who had lived through the siege. Growth patterns had been disrupted, immune systems weakened, and various chronic conditions developed as a result of their ordeal. Some children, like Thomas Miller, would carry the physical marks of their experience for the rest of their lives. The economic rebuilding of Vicksburg created new opportunities. and challenges for families trying to reestablish their lives. Elizabeth Loughborough had parlayed her organizational skills, developed during the refugee crisis, into a position helping Union authorities coordinate civilian relief efforts. Her daughter Mary Catherine often accompanied her on these missions, serving as a bridge between the occupying forces and local families, who remained suspicious of Union intentions. Memory and narrative became important elements in how the siege experience was processed and understood by its survivors. The children who had lived through the ordeal found themselves in the unique position of having witnessed history from a perspective that was largely ignored in official accounts and military histories. Mary Catherine's diary, which she continued to maintain after the surrender, became an invaluable record of the civilian experience that would prove historically significant for future generations seeking to understand the human cost of the Civil War. The long-term impact of the Vicksburg siege on its youngest survivors would extend far beyond the immediate post-war period. These children had experienced a level of adversity and responsibility that fundamentally altered their understanding of the world and their place in it. As they grew to adulthood in the decades following the war, many would carry with them lessons about resilience, community solidarity, and the importance of bearing witness to experiences that might otherwise be forgotten or overlooked by official histories focused primarily on military strategy and political outcomes. The story of Vicksburg's siege, as experienced by its children, families, and refugees, serves as a reminder that the human cost of warfare extends far beyond casualty statistics and strategic objectives. In the voices of young people like Mary Catherine Loughborough, Rebecca Walsh, Thomas Jefferson Miller, and Patricia and Balfour, we find a different perspective on one of the Civil War's most decisive campaigns, one that emphasizes survival, adaptation, and the remarkable resilience of the human spirit in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges.